The third and the last structural classifications of joints are the synovial joints. The synovial joints are the most common and the most complex of the structural classifications of joints. A key characteristic of synovial joints is the presence of a joint cavity, which is filled with a lubricating fluid called synovial fluid. The joint itself is composed of a joint capsule that surrounds the ends of the two bones, and the bones within the joint cavity are not directly connected to one another, which allows them really great mobility. The fibrous and the cartilaginous joints that we saw in previous segments lacked a joint cavity completely. So all synovial joints are functionally classified as diarthroses because they are considered freely movable. So some synovial joints are more mobile than other synovial joints, but even the least mobile of the synovial joints still permits more movement than the cartilaginous joints or the fibrous joints. The synovial joints are typically named for the bones or the structures on those bones that are united within the joint capsule. So a good example of this is the glenohumeral joint, which is the synovial joint found at the shoulder. It's named for the glenoid fossa on the scapula, which forms a connection with the humerus at the shoulder joint, while the knee joint is referred to as the tibiofemoral joint because it represents the joint in which the tibia and the femur come together at the knee. So the synovial joint capsule, or the articular capsule, is composed of two layers, the joint capsule layer and the synovial membrane. The joint capsule is typically composed of dense irregular connective tissue, while the synovial membrane secretes the synovial fluid that fills the cavity. And typically there are reinforcing ligaments that surround and support the joint capsule. These ligaments are technically not part of the synovial joint capsule itself, but rather help reinforce it from the exterior. The ligaments are composed of dense regular connective tissue, just like the other ligaments that we've seen in the body so far. Other structures that provide great reinforcement to synovial joints are the muscles and their tendons that act across the synovial joints. Although there are no muscles pictured in this diagram, synovial joints in the body typically have many muscles and many tendons that cross over them. Turning our attention to the synovial fluid, we see that the synovial fluid is composed of mostly water, but it has a viscous or thick egg white-like consistency due to the presence of this substance called hyaluronic acid. The fluid becomes thinner and less viscous when the joints warm up during movement or activity. So that's why it's important to warm up before any kind of vigorous exercise, is to make sure that the fluid within the joints is going to flow adequately as you are moving. We also see capping the ends of the two bones within that synovial joint, we see thin layers of hyaline cartilage that are called articular cartilage that covers the ends of the bones within that synovial joint. So this thin layer helps to absorb compressive forces that are placed on the joint, and it also provides a smooth surface that allows these bones to glide over one another during joint motion. So notice that this articular cartilage does not directly unite the bones. It's the capsule itself that's forming the joint rather than the cartilage. The cartilage is simply there to protect the ends of the two bones that are within that synovial joint. But that's why this is not a cartilaginous joint, even though it does have cartilage in it. It's because the cartilage is not directly connecting these two bones together. The cartilage is simply forming a protective layer for those bones. So what was not shown in the previous diagram are the numerous sensory fibers that are typically called joint kinesthetic receptors that occupy the fibrous capsule. Most of the sensory nerve fibers detect joint position and joint stretch, and so these joint kinesthetic receptors, these nerve fibers, are used by the brain to coordinate body movements. A few of them do detect painful stimuli at the joints, and so this helps the brain determine what position the joints are in and what position the skeleton is in kind of as a whole, and so that helps the brain coordinate muscle movements and things like that. So this diagram also more clearly highlights the structures that belong to the joint capsule, so which are the fibrous capsule, which makes up the outer layer of the joint capsule, and the synovial membrane, which makes up the inner layer of that joint capsule and secretes the synovial fluid. So a couple of the synovial joints in the body have fibrocartilage structures located between the bones within that synovial joint. So if the fibrocartilage structure or fibrocartilage pad that is present in that joint is oval-shaped, it is called an articular disc. And if that fibrocartilage pad is C-shaped, it's called a meniscus. But both of these articular discs and meniscus have the same function and helps to pad and protect the ends of the two bones within this particular synovial joint. So one such example of these fibrocartilage structures are the medial meniscus and the lateral meniscus that are found in the knee joint. So here the meniscus acts to absorb shock and to help keep the femur aligned with the tibia at the knee joint. So not all synovial joints have these, only a few of them in the body do, and the lateral and medial meniscus within the knees are a prominent example of these fibrocartilage meniscus structures. Other structures like bursa and tendon sheaths are located externally to synovial joints. So notice that the articular discs and the meniscus that we saw in the previous slide were located internally to the synovial joint, whereas these bursa and tendon sheaths that we're going to talk about here are located externally to synovial joints. So bursa and tendon sheaths serve to reduce friction between the muscles or the connective tissue or the skin that are superficial to these synovial joints. So they're serving to reduce friction but between the synovial joint and structures external to those synovial joints. Bursa and tendon sheaths are structures that resemble synovial joints in that they are sac-like structures that contain synovial fluid. And their function is to really serve as bearings that help to reduce friction between bones or tendons or bones and skin as the bones move, and the bursa and tendon sheaths help the structures external to those synovial joints roll over them more easily rather than get caught or impede their movement in any way. So bursa tend to reduce friction by separating adjacent structures, so they separate skin, ligaments, muscles, or tendons from the synovial joint structures, which prevents these structures from rubbing directly against one another during movement of the skeleton. And tendon sheaths tend to function in the same way, except they are found kind of specifically wrapped around individual tendons, typically where the tendon crosses a synovial joint. And so they're acting as bearings for those tendons that are crossing over those synovial joints, helping the tendon to roll over those synovial joints with really very little friction, or helping to reduce friction of that tendon moving over that synovial joint.